everybody, and welcome to Calling All Creatures. As many of you already know, I am your host, Lori, and tonight we have a very interesting podcast about a very little creature in the animal kingdom. But man, that little creature can do all sorts of things, and it's really cool, some of the things that you guys are going to learn about these guys tonight. I'm talking about ants, and the podcast title is Ants, the King of the Hills, and let me tell you, these little guys can do some stuff. But I have Zachary Liu on with me tonight. He is a myrmecologist and also a professional ant farmer, which we'll have him tell us maybe a little bit more about as well, because that's pretty interesting in itself. And he's going to give us all sorts of information about ants and all the really cool things that I bet a lot of you don't know about ants, because I sure learned a whole lot. Towards the end, I'll have Zach go ahead and give out some, he's on YouTube channel too, so if you guys want to really learn a whole lot about ants, you can go watch his YouTube videos as well. They're pretty cool. So anyway, with that being said, Zach, thank you so much for being on the podcast tonight. I really appreciate it, because I'm looking forward to learning a lot more about ants.
No worries. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, that's awesome. So why don't you just go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, how did you first get interested in insects and ants and stuff?
Yeah, great. So first off, I'm a myrmecologist at McGill University here in Montreal, Canada, and really, for me, insects, it's always been something that I've worked with in my life. Like my mom, she was born in a really rural part of China, and like the story goes that she was really afraid of bugs, and then so when I was born here in Canada, she wanted to make sure that it wasn't something that affected me, because for her, bugs were everywhere in China. So when I was a little kid, she'd, I guess like after the bedtime story, she'd pull out like an encyclopedia, flip to the insect section, and kind of get me used to everything. And then so kind of all my life I've worked with insects. I've worked with nature generally. I've most of the smaller animals, like I was the type of kid that came back home with frogs in the pockets. And for me, ants just kind of came as a natural transition. I think that their behavior was super interesting, and it started off when I started keeping ants, kind of in my little like husbandry spree, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you mentioned myrmecologist, so why don't you go ahead and explain just what a myrmecologist is?
Yeah, so a myrmecologist is basically an ant scientist. So right now I'm still a student, but I've worked with a couple researchers for help on. Usually it'll be like new species ranges for different ants. So, for example, it would be like, we're the first people to find X type of species of ant in Canada. I'm also working on a separate project right now, and it's about like the evolution of ants, where we're using a couple molecular techniques basically to find a specific type of like cellular process, and because the theory is that like a specific type of cell dying in ants is actually one of the causes that they're able to collaborate so well that they've become eusocial animals.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say at the end of the day, generally, for me, working with ants on like the academic side is probably a little bit is probably the least of what I do. I do a lot in terms of, so I run a little company, it's called Canada Ant Colony, and basically sell like ant farm kits, little ant colonies, and that's to like films, that's to ant keepers, and that's to like even pet stores. And I also run a couple social media accounts, and so that's on like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. I'm on a channel called Down the Anthill. And the idea is that I think that the stories of ants are so so interesting, and a lot of times they mirror a lot of what happens in our world up here, I guess, so to speak. And it's their stories we're looking to tell.
Right. You know, and it's funny because I was actually going to ask you about the ant farmer thing, about who you actually would raise ants for, and sell them to, because I don't know if I could ever say that I've actually ever heard of someone being an ant farmer before.
Well, I think that most people, or not most people, but I think a lot of people have kept ants before, especially when they're little. They might have grabbed like a jar of dirt or sand and
I was gonna say something like that, or one of those little ant farms, for like a project or something for school. Yeah.
Right. So, ant keeping is a hobby that's been evolving over time, and like that was in the same way that like. Probably every engineer has like thrown little paper airplanes as a kid. Right now, a lot of ant keeping, it looks like colonies of ants that live for like decades, colonies of ants that have queens, and that you get to see all the behaviors that you would see outside in the wild happen. Like kind of the idea, the selling point is basically it's like a little civilization on your desk.
Right. And it's better to, say, go to an ant farmer like yourself to get, these types of ants, rather than to just go take them out of the wild, because I'm going to say that probably wouldn't be good for the ants, number one, because, they're used to, I guess, a specific routine and stuff like that in the wild, and you would uproot them. So, they would probably adapt, I guess, but I don't know. So it'd probably be better, though, I would say, to get them from you, rather than just go uproot them, correct?
The main thing is that, typically the colonies that we work with are colonies that start from queens, and usually when you're looking outside, what you're going to find is just workers, and that means they're basically like most of the ants you see outside, they're not going to be able to reproduce, they're not going to be able to start a colony,
right.
And really it's kind of the equivalent of like putting a bunch of people in a room and then they kind of slowly die out. Generally the idea is that with ant colonies with the queens, it's just because it's the way they grow and reproduce in the wild. It means that the colonies are lasting a lot longer, and because, for example, the worker ants have to take care of brood, like the babies, they have to take care of the queen, they have to like make sure to organize the nest, manage disease. It's a lot more, I'm gonna say, than generally if you were just to like pick up an ant outside. Now, I will add that. Like it is possible to find queens outside, and that's also what we do. It's just generally something that happens on a very seasonal basis. So, like if you decide just, hey, I want to start an ant farm with an ant queen, it's generally very difficult to just run outside and do it unless you're very patient. You're willing to wait maybe like a couple months, depending on like the types of ants you like, right, or that you want to work with.
Right. So now that you just said that, now you just had me think of a couple of questions I want to throw here. Okay, so number one, if you have an ant colony, like you say someone gets from you, so basically, how are you taking care of that colony? I mean, what would be, I'm assuming you would give them recommendations or tell them how to take care of the colony. What would they be feeding the ants and stuff like that? How would they be caring for their colonies?
Well, the thing is with ant keeping is that, the nice thing about keeping ants is that the ants do most of the work, and so a lot of times you're kind of just there giving them the resources and the space they need. So generally care looks like, most ant setups will come in two parts. There's one part, it's called the formicarium. It's typically made of like a plaster or a wood or like some absorbent material, but the idea is that it's supposed to simulate the underground. It'll have chambers carved out. It's where the ants live, it's where like the babies grow up, and it's where like the queen lives, right? There's also the outworld, so that's generally and that's generally what for the ants is outside. It's where they're collecting food, where they're putting their garbage, and really all you have to do is maintain those two portions. So what that looks like is maybe for 5 minutes a week you add water into the nest, into the formicarium, into the underground portion, and then the ants, they'll eat like a mix of sugar and like protein, so that might be like some maple syrup or some honey, and like a cricket or a mealworm, and generally that type of diet is enough to keep most ants going. Or to keep them happy, rather.
Okay. And so, how big of a colony are you talking about? Is that a fairly smaller one? I mean, for just doing a little bit of the sugar in a cricket or a mealworm, or how big of a colony would you be talking about for that?
Generally, those are colonies that are in their first year or so. So that might look like somewhere between 20 and up to even like 100 workers.
Okay.
Bigger colonies are going to, they don't, like, they require more care in the sense that you're going to be giving them more water, more sugar, more food, like, generally. But, like, for example, like, the frequency of feeding and the actual maintenance doesn't really change. Like, even, for example, this is my favorite fact about ant keeping, but you're actually able to potty train your ants. So, like ants in the wild, they have this instinct, and the idea is that they take their garbage and they put it far away from the nest, and they'll pick like this little dry spot. And the idea is that if it's somewhere dry, it's not going to mold, it's not going to ferment, it's not going to rot, and it's not going to bring disease into the colony. So in captivity, the ants are going to find somewhere in the outworld, the foraging area, that feels relatively dry, and they're going to treat that as a garbage pile. And now the thing is, one of the fun things about ants is that they all work together, they all communicate with each other, and like they'll go around and inspect what other ants have done and work based off of that. So one thing you can do, if you put like a little jar out in the foraging container, you put their garbage inside it, the ants will think, okay, well, I have to put garbage in the garbage pile, and it just so happens that it's moved to this little jar, and they'll keep putting garbage in the jar.
Wow, okay. That's pretty cool. Oh, that's great. Potty training an ant. Oh my gosh. Who knew?
Well, it's fun because they kind of, most of them are kind of pre-trained, right? They already know how to do it as long as you show them.
Right.
Well, not you show them, but as long as you start them off.
Oh my gosh, that's great. Okay, and then so now I do know too, like, I don't know if it's just certain ants or certain colonies, but what happens, say, you know, the queen and they have baby ants, what happens if, say, you have another queen or two queens or something like that born in the same colony? Now, would you have to kind of split that colony up because you can't have more than one queen? And then, you know, how would, say, the average layperson, I mean, I'm assuming there's characteristics to be able to recognize the queen. I think she's bigger than the other ants and stuff like that.
Yeah, so the way ants reproduce is a lot like the way trees reproduce. And that might not make that much sense at first, but the idea is that, so you have the queen, and she's basically like the reproductive organs of a colony, and the workers are kind of there to support her to pass on like to pass on those genes, right? Mm-hmm. So generally what happens is that once the colony reaches a certain size, in the same way that once a tree reaches a certain age, the ants will start producing new queens and males, and those are like the little winged ants, basically. You've probably seen them from time to time, especially like right after any rains or like monsoons, and it's something similar on in the same way that like trees will produce like bunches of seeds at a specific time of year. So generally what happens is that when conditions are just right, all the colonies in an area, they decide to release all the queens and males all at once. And like they go out, they mate, they land on the ground, and they find a place to start a new colony. And so the thing is, even though new queens are produced, they don't really replace the one in the original mother colony, in the same sense that like a tree will produce seeds, but if you chop down the main tree, it doesn't really, like this, you can't really put a seed back in it and regrow the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Okay. So does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I was just wondering how you would work that out, so. Alright. Well, let's just go ahead. I want to talk about some of the stuff that I saw in your videos because I thought it was so cool and I learned so much from them. So, yeah, I think the people out there are going to really like some of these things. So, we'll start out with, how have ants evolved since prehistoric times?
Well, so ants actually are a type of wasp ultimately, right? So are bees, so are like hornets, wasps, whatever. And basically, the way that a lot of these like social insects started out is that they'd be like, it would be a social wasp that happens to like take care a wasp where like the siblings will take care of each other, right? And the idea is that progressively over time, if these wasps are taking care of more and more of their siblings, then they become more and more social, and slowly the colonies, so to speak, that have larger numbers that are able to better take care of themselves, end up being the ones that survive. And so you get colonies, and so like even now you go outside, there's like species of wasps where they'll have colonies of like 3 or 4, and the idea is that they slowly, and the idea is that what evolution has done is that they've slowly increased the colony size, and also as a result, the ants or wasps that are in the colony are able to specialize more. Like a very big part of for ants specifically was like basically having their wings degenerate instead of having them grow out. And then so you have ants that instead of having wing muscles, they're able to have stronger leg muscle. They're able to run faster. They're able to like have more space for like different organs for pheromones. And it's really interesting because ants they evolved, I believe, like a little bit close to like the end of the Mesozoic, so when dinosaurs were alive. And like the first ants compared to the ones now are very different. So for example, you'll have a lot of species that are called vampire ants, and the idea is that, or one of the theories is that one of the reasons that they would raise so many larvae or have a lot of workers was originally kind of as like a backup food storage. And then so you have these species of ants where their main food source, or they'll feed their babies, and then their main food source of the adults is like drinking the blood of like their brood. There's other species like these are pretty famous, but they're extinct now. But for example, like they're called hell ants. Basically, you had these ants that were like a little bit over an inch long. This was during the time of the dinosaurs, where they had jaws that bit vertically, and so they'd have a spike, and they kind of impale prey with it.
Oh my! Okay. Wow, that's crazy. I'm just thinking about that ant and impaling their prey. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, they have like it's an interesting insect specifically because so some animals, and this is a very common trait in the animal kingdom, but they're able to incorporate metal into different parts of their body. And then in this case, it was one of the first examples of like a prehistoric insect in particular. What scientists were looking at is that the speed and the force at which they were biting down normally would be hard enough to basically like break their heads like as they're biting down. And then so you have ant species where they reinforce their heads with basically a layer of metal, and that absorbs a lot of the force and makes it a lot stronger of a weapon.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that too, about ants that create their own armor. I was going to ask you to tell us about that more, because I thought that was just crazy. The ants create their own armor.
Yeah, so there's a couple species of ants. These are especially leafcutter ants, where they seem to have developed the ability to take metal from their diet. So like think about how we have to eat iron, or like zinc or calcium, and the ants have done this with like magnesium and zinc, and they incorporate it into their armor, and in some species their jaws. So for example, like the best example of this is some leafcutter ants. So they're basically these massive like we're gonna say like leaf eaters. They live in the rainforest in North and South America. They go up into the trees, they cut up leaves, and they bring it back down and chew it into a fertilizer for a fungus, like a mushroom that they're farming to eat. And the thing is, because they're cutting so much, and because when you're an ant, like leaves are relatively very thick, one way that they conserve energy, it seems, is by literally sharpening their jaws by lining the teeth with like a metal, and that makes it easier for like the workers to gather leaves by cutting them up more easily, more efficiently. But it also made some ants, it also made the soldiers be able to bite down on enemies more effectively. And then so specifically for a couple leafcutter ant species, there's a little arms race going on. We have some species that are developing tough metal armor to kind of protect themselves from these strong bites, and then on the other end, as that armor becomes stronger, you're also seeing stronger and stronger metal jaws.
Wow, that's crazy. I could not believe that when I was reading that about ants, and that they have their own armor that they can make with that was crazy.
And I think the funniest thing is that I'm not sure if you can pull up a picture on I guess on the final recording, but when you look at the pictures of these ants, you can actually see like the metal coating on them. It's like a very thin, like silver lining on some parts of their bodies.
Mm-hmm. Right. Maybe I can find a picture I can post on my Facebook page for the podcast. We'll see. I'll have to take a look and see if I can find a picture. That I know. I couldn't believe that when I was reading that, though. I was just like, oh my God, they make their own armor. What the heck? And then we go into, let's go into politics. So, ants and democracies. I thought that was very interesting, too. So ants can have democracies.
Yeah, so I think that it's a common misconception that because ants have a queen that they reign the same way that a monarch does. This is a fun Ray Mendez quote, but so Ray Mendez is someone who used to work with ants, actually in Arizona, and used to work with a lot of documentaries. And his little thing was like, it's because like a lot of early myrmecologists, like ant scientists, were British, and so he was like, okay, well, they kind of like stick a queen wherever they can go. But really, so the way that most ants make decisions is, for a lot of big decisions, it's left up to basically the votes of any of the informed members in the colony. And when I say informed members, I mean something like this. So the way that ants move, for example, is you'll have a couple ants that'll investigate like some new area, some new nesting space. They'll go in, they'll look around, and if they like it, they'll come back and they'll bring a friend. And then if both of those, and if the friend's impressed, he comes back, or rather she comes back, brings another friend, and then slowly kind of news travels through the colony. And then if at some point like a critical mass of the colony decide or say, oh, it looks like generally we think that this is a good place to stay, then generally the ants will start moving on their own. And the idea is that I think ants are opposite to people in this sense, but ants individually are pretty dumb, but collectively they're able to make really good decisions. Humans are the opposite. I think most people are pretty smart, but together they're a little bit dumber.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
But what's really fun about what kind of is coming out, which is actually why we're seeing that ants aren't like monarchies, basically, is that you'll have some species of ants, or even some populations, where the queens and the workers are kind of at odds. So a lot of queens, for example, will produce chemicals that repress the reproduction of the other worker ants. And like a phenomenon that we've been observing recently is that in some species, those workers will basically revolt. They'll kill the queen, they'll replace her with a group of workers that each lay a small number of eggs instead of having the queen lay all the eggs in the colony.
Okay.
It's also interesting because there's also ants that have like more specialized tasks, and this is something I find really, really interesting, but ants, their brains will specialize like very intensely to one task. So you'll have ants where like the navigation centers of their brain are massive compared to the other ants, and even compared to the rest of their own brain. And then it seems that there's a system where, let's say the ants have to get somewhere. That might be, for example, finding a rival nest or finding a food source. Sometimes, for a lot of species, this is very species dependent. What they'll do is that what the designated scouts, so the ants that have these enlarged navigation centers, they'll follow their decision. So it's a little bit of a democracy in the sense that generally it's like the collective or like a large number of ants having to agree on something for it to happen, but it's also not something where every single ant has to vote on every single thing. It's a little bit like us, or most governments in here.
Yeah, it is. It's quite a bit. I mean, when you really stop and look at it. So, okay, ants that explode themselves. Why do we have ants that explode themselves? And why and how do they do this?
Yeah, so there's a couple of species that do this, and mostly they're found in like the Southeast Asian jungle, and basically in a lot of most of these ants seem to have the ability to, the ants that explode, most of them that have the ability to do so to defend themselves from other ants. And generally, ants are an organism that most animals generally choose not to mess with. Like they're not super worth hunting. The nutritional value isn't very high. Right. They're gonna fight back. They're gonna bite. They're gonna sting. And a lot of times, for ants, that means colonies that are smaller have a risk of being outnumbered by bigger colonies. Or, for example, if there are larger ant species that are around, then like smaller workers can easily get overpowered. So there's a complex of ants called Colobopsis saundersi complex or explodens complex, and what they do is that as they age, they produce like a sticky toxic glue in their abdomens, right? And the idea is that in most ants, the oldest workers are also the ones that are outside. So they're foragers, they're soldiers, they're guards. And then so the most toxic workers, let's say that they're surrounded by a bunch of ants from another species or from a different colony, what they do is that they clench really hard, and the muscles in their abdomens rip apart and kind of splatter the glue everywhere. The idea is that these are normally workers that are already at the end of their lives, and so if the colony's in danger, having them kind of go out in that way potentially takes a few foes with them. Right.
I just couldn't believe exploding ants, though. I'm just like, oh my god.
It's not a very common adaptation, right?
Right.
One anecdote that I find is funny is that in some of the papers that initially described the species, the authors talk about when they were trying to collect specimens from the colony, they'd have workers run up to their thumbs and blow up. And so there's a little bit more difficulty than with a lot of the other species.
They're like little kamikaze ants.
Yeah, that's the idea, right?
Right? Oh my gosh, little kamikaze ants.
Yeah, it's like, and that adds to the idea where generally things don't mess with ants unless they're specialized in messing with ants.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Because I'm not gonna if your prey blows itself up, maybe it's not so worth it.
I was just thinking, could you imagine somebody who didn't really know anything about ants and they just happened upon one of these ants and saw it and they reached down to grab it and it come up and it exploded on them? They would freak out.
Right, it's like a chemically smell too, so.
Oh my. Then they'd really freak out. They'd be like, oh my god.
Right, most ants are chemists to some degree. So, a lot of the really cool adaptations, they'll have some sort of weird chemical mixture. Either that hurts you, or a lot of times like communicates with other ants or other organisms around them.
Right. Oh my, that was just, I can just see it now. Little exploding ant bombs. And with that being said, since we have little exploding ants, we also have CIA ants. So when you got terrorist exploding ants, you got to have the CIA involved. So what do our CIA ants do?
It is a bit of a clickbaity title, but
I didn't know if it was.
It comes from most ants will have. So most ants' biggest enemy is other ants, because generally most organisms don't mess with ants. And so generally the biggest threat is other ants in the area. And so one thing that a lot of species will have is that they'll have scouts that kind of look around, look for, like for example, like other nests that either they can raid, or sometimes they'll interfere with them, like they'll cover their nest entrances with stones, so it's more difficult to leave them until they clear out the whole spot. And so a lot of ant species have basically like a counterintelligence, where they'll have kind of patrols around the nest, where their job is to find scouts and kill them as fast as they can, basically, because if they can't report the information back to the main colony, there's like not as much of a threat of an invasion.
Right. Kind of like with us here as humans, you got your counterintelligence agents. That's kind of what they're doing, trying to help keep our country safe from other people coming in and doing things.
The thing about ants is that because they're able to communicate, it also means that they have like little propaganda messaging too. I think some of the most interesting ants are called social parasites, but the way it works is that you'll have an ant species that's unable to start a colony on its own. So what it does is that it finds a colony of a related species that can start on its own. The queen runs in, pretends to be, depends what it's. Different species do different things. Some of them, for example, will pretend to be a piece of fruit so they get brought into the nest. Some of them just have really thick legs that are difficult to bite onto, and they'll charge right in. They'll assassinate the queen, and then they'll rub their bodies onto the queen's corpse, and the idea is that they can steal some of the scent. They can pretend to be the queen, and they'll produce what are called kind of propaganda chemicals, where it kind of forcibly puts the other ants into a state of panic, and what happens is that they're too panicked to organize to make a well-organized defense. And what happens is that the interloper, so the new queen, the parasite queen, they'll basically try to brainwash the other workers into believing that they're the real queen all along, and then so you'll slowly see a colony of one species. They'll get replaced by a colony of another species, as kind of the workers are as the old workers slowly die off, and the new ones are of entirely different species of ant.
Oh wow, that's crazy! I'm telling you, learning an awful lot about ants that I never knew. I hope you guys are learning as much out there as what I've been learning about ants. It's crazy some of the things these little buggers do. So now we're coming to, we have ant slaves, so we have ant slave revolts. Can you tell us more about the ant revolts?
Yeah, no worries. So I'll talk a little bit about the ant keeping too about this. So
okay, cool.
They're called a lot of parasitic species. What they do is that, or they're more difficult to keep, and it's not only because they have to start off the colony that's not their own, but it's because that a lot of times the workers will find out, or they'll try to find out, and if they realize that something's off or something's amiss, they think, okay, I think that the babies that are growing up right now, they're a different species. They'll start sabotaging things.
Oh, wow.
So they'll kill the babies, they'll throw them out. Sometimes again, this all depends on the species. They'll even like kill the queen straight up. And this is especially well studied in a species of acorn ants. And there's literally these ants where an entire colony fits in an acorn. Where you'll have one big species called Temnothorax americanus, the American slave-making ant, where it invades other acorn ant species to basically they kill the adults and then they take the babies back home, and the babies grow up to work for the slave-making ants. And what a couple more recent, I say recent, but I guess it's been like 15 years now. But what some of these more recent papers are finding was that it turns out that a lot of times these rebellions are effective enough where you're having 75% of all the slave maker babies like wiped out because they're found out by basically rebelling worker ants.
Huh. That is... I just can't believe some of the things these ants do. That's just amazing. I mean, the intelligence, that's going on with all of that. That's just amazing.
I think for some of these behaviors, it's, like there's a risk, not to say that it isn't the case, but there's like a little bit of a risk in establishing that there's like an intelligence per se. But a lot of the reasons that scientists believe that, for example, slave revolts exist, right, is that even though the workers in the slave-making colony, they can't reproduce, they can't pass on their genes, if they have any like related colonies, like colonies of like cousins or siblings, even, the idea is that if they weaken the slave raiding colonies enough, they're unable to go out and attack their relatives. And now the thing is, like, the ants probably individually don't have an understanding of, oh, if I do this, then I can help my sisters,
right?
Because like most of these, they're never raised anywhere else. But it's more so that the ants that were more picky about which babies to raise, those populations were able to push out the slave raiders a lot more easily.
Okay, makes sense.
Not that it doesn't come out similarly to a lot of the behaviors that we put to humans because we call them intelligent.
Yeah. I was gonna say, it's funny because just in the things that we've talked about here up till now, you see so many similarities between the ants and the humans' behaviors. I mean, you really do. It's so you gotta wonder. So the ants were here for so long. I mean, did humans maybe see some of these things that ants were doing, and maybe we're mimicking the ants? I don't know. It's kind of interesting how close they are.
Most of these things the ants definitely came up with first.
Right.
And we probably just happened upon the same thing later.
Yeah.
But what I think is really interesting about ants is that, like, human society I feel like has really only had like a couple runs so far, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like empires rise and fall, but like at the end of the day, there's not that many of them.
Right.
Ants, in the meanwhile, they have a lot of the same dynamics, but these things will be happening hundreds of times, like in our own backyards, every single year. And then so the way ants evolve kind of tends towards the best strategies for the entire colony are the ones that get passed down. And I think that in the same sense that a lot of times, like engineers will look to nature for example, like propellers that are inspired by the designs on like the wings on seeds. I think a lot of times when we're looking at what types of behaviors encourage the survival of entire societies, I think ants provide a really good model for that.
Right. Yeah.
Not that it's a one-to-one. Like, I'm not proposing that we start using pheromones.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we have ants that will fight in war with each other and things like that. So I guess when you have fighting in war, then you need to have paramedics, and so there are paramedic ants. What do the paramedic ants do?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, there's a lot of ants that have like raiding behaviors, and sometimes this means raiding other ants. Sometimes this means raiding, in this case, termites. And one behavior that seems to have come up is that a lot of ant raids will have groups of ants that kind of flank the central raid column. And what they're there to do is that they find any ants that have been injured in the fighting, they pick them up and they bring them home, and they bring them home and treat them, basically. And the idea is that it's a lot cheaper. It's a lot more effective to like recover a lot of these ants that could potentially fight another day with good care than to let them die and kind of like grow a new one, right? Mm-hmm. But what's really interesting, I found this a little bit jarring, actually. But for example, one of the studies they uses Pseudomonas. So it's a bacteria that infects both ants and humans, right? Okay. And what's really weird is that the ants, if they're untreated, they die over 90% of the time. But when they're treated, I think that drops to like 8%. So more than 90% of the treatments are successful. They'll create like an antibiotic in their saliva. They'll apply it to like infected joints, and then the ones that are too far gone, they'll amputate at certain areas. And what was interesting is that for some of these diseases, specifically like Pseudomonas, and obviously this isn't a one-to-one comparison, but like hospital outbreaks in modern hospitals will have lower survival rates than when the ants are dealing with them.
Interesting. Yeah, that is kind of interesting, huh?
Like, obviously there's a lot of factors. Like, there's going to be more like immunocompromised folks in the hospitals, and the ants generally aren't dealing with that as much, for example.
Yeah, that's true.
But I think it does say to how effective a lot of the strategies that the ants are employing are, that they even could be compared to like parts of a modern medical system.
Right. So, wanted to ask too, why do ants live in colonies like they do, and do all of the ants live in colonies?
Okay. So all ants do live in colonies, and generally that's one of the features that define ants as a group of animals, as a taxa, I'm going to say. But the colony sizes within ants does vary a lot. So you'll have a lot of primitive species where their colonies might look like 2, 3, 4, 5 workers, and then you'll have other species that are specialized or evolved for like swarm raiding tactics, or like more modern species where they exist where there's been a lot of push towards larger colonies, where you'll have colonies that literally have hundreds of millions of workers.
Okay.
I think most of the ants that you see in your yard, they're probably going to be something closer to like the 2,000 to 3,000 to let's say 2,000 to 15,000 workers. But like they do get well into the millions, especially in more tropical areas. Or particular species that they make what are called super colonies. So a lot of unrelated colonies will work together and team up against other ants, or not against other ants, but to work together and share resources. And then so you'll have effectively billions of ants working together. Right.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if all ants lived in colonies, or if you might have a certain type of ant that kind of lived on its own or not. So I wanted to kind of clarify that. So, ant hills. Obviously, a lot of ants make ant hills and stuff. Most ants make ant hills, and whether they've got a big mound of dirt outside or it's just a hole in the ground that they've kind of, excavated. But how large are some of the largest ant hills, and what countries could some of those be found in?
Well, so one thing I do want to clarify here is that anthills are surprisingly sophisticated. So it does depend on the species, but for example, the most famous ones, so European wood ants, they'll incorporate like medicinal resins into the hills, basically, where when they're coming home from outside, they're walking over what's basically a disinfectant. They're cleaning themselves in the process. Yeah. And the thing is, a lot of larger anthills, what they act as is they're basically like a bad solar panel. What it does is that the ant will grab a lot of very absorbent materials that might look like stones. A lot of times that looks like pine needles, and they'll throughout the day they'll actually they'll move the needles such that they absorb like the sun in the morning, and then in the midday they kind of reflect it back. And the idea is that a lot of the nests have a lot in terms of regulating the circulation in the nest and regulating the temperature. And then so you'll see for example, in a captive setting, you'll see ants move the babies and the queen throughout the nest throughout the day, kind of in seek of the optimal temperature as like the day passes. But I would say the largest ones are probably like in Europe. You'll have Formica rufa, so those are the wood ants I was talking about. But those mounds, they'll get to like a little bit taller than a person, I think. But even in the States, especially in the Southwest United States, so that's all the way from like inland Oregon all the way to like southern Texas and even the Dakotas, there's a group of ants called the harvester ants, and what they do is that they clear out large chunks of vegetation around their nests, and as a result you can actually see, like if you use a satellite and zoom into one of those areas, you can see the landscape dotted with these mounds absorbing the sun.
Wow, that's crazy. Well, I looked at some of the pictures of some of the ant hills, and I saw some of those that were like quite a bit larger than a person. They were pretty crazy. And I know termites will do the same thing. They make the large hills and stuff too sometimes.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that they'll have like basically AC systems involved where wind is specifically directed on one, where when like wind hits these mounds, it specifically flushes out the air through like different ventilation tubes at the top, basically, like in the same way that a factory smokestack might do it.
Right. So ants in general, what do ants in general do to help the ecology of an area? And on the flip side of that, can ants also do damage in the ecology of an area?
So I think this is a really rough question because, sorry, give me 1 second. Sorry about that. So I think this is a really bit of a difficult question because like ants are a part of the ecology of an ecosystem. So it's weird to say whether they help or harm it because like they are the ecology per se. But what I will say is that a lot of ants, they are really important in terms of regulating the insect populations in the area and the plant populations. Mm-hmm. So for example, one thing ants will do is that they'll aerate the soil just because they're often digging and clearing so much soil and bring it to the surface. Another example is some species will decide to kill certain plants and keep others for various usages. Ants will farm other insects too. So that might aphids are the most common example where you'll basically have it's an insect that sucks sap out of different plants, and the ants protect them in return for some of the leftover sap that comes out as a very sugary substance. So but at the same time, so ants do a lot of, I'm going to say, killing a lot of the other insects. They do a lot of decomposition, and they aerate the soil, and they plant different seeds. And now, the way they damage the ecology theoretically is in the same ways. So, for example, like different invasive species might plant seeds that are also invasive, or they might kill native insects at a greater rate because they didn't develop the same defenses against those types of ants.
Right.
Or let's say, especially in, for example, like in farms, if the ants are farming aphids on, for example, like citrus trees, they're basically it's often enough to stump the growth of the trees and the crops. And now, whether that's a good thing is, I think, a lot more subjective. Generally, most ants that are native to an area will be important in terms of maintaining those ecological processes, and most ants that aren't native to the area generally tend to push away from those.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was wondering. I kind of figured, if they were more of an invasive type of thing where they, got brought into an area where they're not normally found or something like that. But, yeah. So, that's with anything, that you do that to, though, too. Not just ants. That's any animal you bring into an area where they're not naturally found. They can damage the ecosystem and the ecology, So, you just always got to be careful with that kind of stuff. So, what if someone wanted to become an ant keeper? How could they go about doing that? You kind of talked about it a little bit in the beginning. And also, if you wanted to go ahead and give us your website info so people could kind of check it out and get some more info, that would be great, because I know you've got a bit of info on your site.
Yeah, so our website is https Canada-ant-colony.com. We have tons of guides. We also do sell ants right now just in Canada, but we're working on a partnership in the States to help with ant keeping there as well. And anyone who wants to learn about ants, feel free to come visit. We have tons of information on the site.
And you mentioned at the beginning your YouTube channel. Let's go ahead and throw that back out there again, because you guys can go and check Zach out on that YouTube channel where he does his little short YouTube videos about the ants too. Those are pretty cool.
Yep, so that's Down the Ant Hill, and we're on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, basically everything you can think of.
Yeah, so... Well, Zach, we're pretty much here at the end of the podcast. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about all these really cool things about ants, because, like I said, I sure did learn an awful lot of stuff about them that I had no idea. Especially, the things that we just discussed here on the podcast, that's just a little bit of touch. You had quite a bit of more stuff out there on the YouTube channel and stuff like that, but these were just a few of the things that I saw that I thought would be interesting to you guys as well, because they were pretty interesting to me. So I'm really glad you could come on and kind of talk about all of those different things and about ants in general, and give us a lot more information on them. It was pretty cool to learn more about them.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you enjoyed the show. I certainly did.
Oh yeah, it was great talking with you about this stuff, because, like I said, I never knew some of the things until I started watching your little videos and looked at your website and stuff. And then I was just like, oh my God, this is so cool. But with that being said, I'm going to let you know I am just going to go ahead and announce my next couple of podcasts coming up. You're welcome to stay on until after I announce those, or like I know most of my guests are kind of busy, so if you want to hop off, you're more than welcome to hop off as well. So
thank you so much. I'm going to pop up, and I'm really sorry. I have a friend waiting at the door.
Oh no, that's no problem. Like I said, I understand that. So again, thanks again, Zach, for being on. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy your evening.
You have a great evening.
All right. Bye now. All right, everybody. So Zach jumped off there. Wow, what an interesting podcast that was. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I sure did. I thought it was really cool to to learn all of these things about ants and some of the things that they do and stuff, because, yeah, that's just interesting. Never knew anything about the armor, exploding ants, paramedic ants. Oh my gosh, democracies, wow, how crazy is that stuff? So anyway, now to go on and announce the next couple podcasts we got coming up. So my next one is going to be on April 17th, and that is actually an update podcast again. That's going to be, Scott Fine is going to be on with me, and we're kind of updating about Scott's organization called Joey's Legacy. Excuse me, I don't know if you guys remember, I had Scott on a while back, and he started Joey's Legacy because his dog, he went to the vet, dog ended up being pretty much misdiagnosed and ended up passing away, and so Scott has started his organization to help other people out there that have maybe had issues, with vets. Vets can do malpractice just like human doctors can, stuff like that. His organization helps people figure out if they do, have something that they need to go to court with or try to go after the vet about. They kind of go over and check out cases that come to them, and then they go from there on deciding whether or not you might have a case to try to go after the vet if you thought your dog or cat or whatever has been misdiagnosed and ended up passing away because of something that the vet may have done or not have done. So Scott's going to be on with us on April 17th, and he's going to tell us about how Joey's Legacy has been doing and about how the cases have been going and how he's been able to help out other people when they've had issues like this. And then the one after that is going to be on May 1st. I am going to have Robert Eccles on with me. Robert is an author and a Christian author, and he has written a book called For Our Friends the Animals. And so I am going to have Robert on to talk about his book. It is basically kind of looking at our friends the animals kind of from a more spiritual Christianity type of view, I guess you would say. So I'm actually glad he's going to be on, and we'll be talking about this with him. So I think it's going to be a really good podcast, and I hope you guys will be able to join us for that as well, because I think we'll learn some stuff from Robert, and I'm kind of looking forward to learning more about his outlook on animals when it comes to having to do with Christianity and spiritualism, stuff like that, So I think that'll be a good one. Okay, so guys, don't forget, April 17th is going to be Joey's Legacy update, and then May 1st for Our Friends the Animals with Robert Eccles. And with that, that's pretty much all I got for you guys tonight. I hope you really did enjoy the podcast tonight. I know I did. And I hope you guys stay really safe out there this coming weekend. Don't get into too much trouble. And don't forget, it's been going on now for a couple months, but don't forget the podcast episode's getting moved back a little bit since Spreaker is not doing live anymore. So, all right, guys, have a good weekend and enjoy. And don't forget to come on back in a couple weeks and listen to the new podcast. All right, bye now.